As we've explained in previous videos, incumbent President Recep Erdogan looks set to lose Turkey's upcoming presidential elections, due for May the 14th. He's a fair bit behind the main opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and the polls show no signs of narrowing. However, while Kılıçdaroğlu's success in the polls has inspired hope in the West, who've been especially irritated by Erdogan's obstructionism on the issue of Sweden's accession to NATO, it's also provoked some anxiety about the prospect of a constitutional crisis if Erdogan refuses to hand over power. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how Erdogan could lose the next election, what Turkish law says should happen if he does, and whether, regardless of what the law says, Erdogan would actually agree to a peaceful transfer of power. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by looking at why Erdogan could lose. The first thing to say here is that we've actually done a fair few videos on this topic before, so if you want to know more, go and watch those. But the TLDR is that polls suggest both Erdogan and his AKP party are currently behind the six-party opposition coalition and their presidential candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. As we see it, there are basically two main reasons Erdogan is losing: his mishandling of the Turkish economy and his government's lackluster response to the earthquake earlier this year. Let's start with the economy. Essentially, because Turkey's economy relies quite heavily on imports, Turkey's inflation rate surged last year. Usually, central banks hike rates to reduce inflation, but Erdogan instead decided to cut rates and fire any central banker who dared to disagree with him. Accordingly, the central banks have cut rates from 19% in March 2021 to 10.5% today. And, as expected, year-on-year inflation has jumped from 20% to above 80% at the end of last year, with unofficial estimates putting it well above 100%. This rapid rise in prices has eaten away at ordinary Turks' living standards and undermined Erdogan's economic record. The second reason is Erdogan's handling of the earthquake. The earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria earlier this year was truly devastating. It caused tens of thousands of deaths, displaced over 1 million people, and the UN estimates that the damage will exceed $100 billion in cost, over 10% of Turkey's GDP. Obviously, a natural disaster isn't anyone's fault, but Erdogan was criticised for both his response and some of the policies that preceded the disaster. Turkey's search and rescue teams were slow to arrive on the scene, and Erdogan's government were criticised for misspending the natural disaster tax revenues, worth about $3.5 billion, and failing to effectively enforce safety regulations brought in after the 1999 earthquake. Anyway, this is why, according to most polls, Erdogan is a couple of points behind Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu in the presidential election, and his AKP party will probably lose their majority at the parliamentary elections. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean Erdogan will lose. After all, there's still a few weeks to go, and Erdogan is a wily political operator. It's also worth saying that polling in Turkey isn't very reliable, and while the opposition do have a lead, it's not because Turks love the opposition, but rather because they're tired of Erdogan, so it could quite easily be reversed. Nonetheless, as things stand, Kılıçdaroğlu is the bookies' favourite, which raises the question, what happens if he wins? Well, according to the 2012 law on presidential elections, it's the responsibility of the Supreme Election Council to announce the winner of the election. For context, the Supreme Election Council is the highest electoral authority in Turkey. It was established by the 1950 Deputies Election Law and had its constitutional role enshrined by the 1961 Constitution after the 1960 military coup. It's composed of 7 senior Turkish judges, who are basically elected by other senior judges in the Turkish court system, and its decision can't be appealed to any other court. Successful political parties are allowed to appoint observers to the council, but they're unable to actually vote on its rulings, which is why, unlike other bits of Turkey's judiciary, it's maintained its independence throughout Erdogan's tenure. So if all went to plan, the Supreme Election Council would tell Erdogan he'd lost, and even if he didn't like it, he wouldn't be able to appeal the result. Kılıçdaroğlu would then take the presidential oath a day or so later, becoming Turkey's new president. So that's what should happen, but will it happen? In other words, will Erdogan actually agree to a peaceful transition of power? Well, unfortunately, there's cause for concern here. For starters, Erdogan himself has resisted election results in the past, most notably at the 2019 Istanbul mayoral election, when Erdogan demanded the election be rerun only to suffer a humiliating defeat the second time around. Now, Erdogan did eventually accept the result, but the fact that he even resisted the results in the first place doesn't bode well. On top of that, there have only been a couple of peaceful transitions of power of the Turkish head of state in Turkey's modern history, and no Turkish president has ever been directly voted out of office. Turkey's first president, Mustafa Ataturk, died in office. His successor refused elections for 12 years, and only left after a resounding defeat. The third president clung on for a decade before being ousted via a military coup and quickly jailed. There were parliamentary elections in the 60s and 70s, but the military held on to the presidency throughout, and then staged another coup in 1980 when they couldn't find a suitable candidate. The military then installed another general as Turkey's seventh president, who only gave up power when he retired in 1989. He was succeeded by a popular MP and leader of the Popular Motherland Party, who became Turkey's first civilian president since 1960. But he died unexpectedly of a heart attack in 1993 before the end of his term, and was automatically succeeded by the then Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel. At the end of his term, Demirel tried and failed to pass a constitutional amendment allowing him a second term, and was then replaced by the President of the Constitutional Court, Ahmet Necdet Sezer, a technocrat who was basically the least unpopular option to the Turkish parliament. Erdogan was then elected Prime Minister in 2003, and, well, he's basically held on to power ever since. He installed his AKP ally Abdullah Gül into the presidency when Sezer's term ended in 2007, and Gül happily handed over power to Erdogan in 2014. So you get the idea. There are very few examples of Turkish presidents peacefully handing over power to an opposing candidate. So what does this mean for Turkey's opposition? Well, perhaps the lesson from the 2019 mayoral election is that to get rid of Erdogan without a constitutional crisis, the opposition need to make sure they win by an undisputable margin. And that may well involve promising the Turkish electorate something more positive than just an end to Erdogan. That's all for this video, but there's a whole world of TLDR content out there. You might not know, but we actually have 5 different TLDR channels explaining news from the UK, Europe and the rest of the world, breaking down the latest developments in the business world and also running through the day's most important news that you might have missed. TLDR has been doing this for around 6 years now, so to celebrate our anniversary, we'd love it if you subscribed. Not only to this channel, but also any of the others that interest you. They're all linked in the description. Our whole purpose is to make the world around you more understandable, to unpack the confusing parts of the news in a way that's interesting, factual, and entirely non-partisan. So if that's something you're into, then you have 5 channels to enjoy. Thanks for your support over the last 6 years. It really means a lot.